Hi everybody, my name's Griffin Bridgers. I'm going to take a little bit of a shift from the usual type of PowerPoint driven video today to give you a bigger rundown on some recent changes to the gift tax return, IRS Form 709, and show you side by side some of those changes when we compare the 2023 form, which has a format that's been pretty consistent for several years, and comparing that to the new form, which has somewhat of a changed format and has significant changes, especially for things like a gift splitting election and marital and charitable deductions and even reverse QTIP elections, each now having its own dedicated column and election to make on the form itself. So we'll start with a little bit of the easy and move on to the more difficult, and then close out with some easier items as well. So as I thumb back and forth, we see here in the old 2023 form, when we looked at the donees or the donors information up here, that oftentimes, especially for the address, a lot had to be crammed onto that line, number, street, and apartment number, and likewise for city, state, and zip, and even foreign country information, all that had to be crammed onto line 6. There is now a little bit more expanded room to take into account address and apartment number separately, and a separate city, town, zip, so on and so forth for domestic addresses within the US, and also some broken out information for foreign country name, foreign province, state, or county, and foreign postal code on new lines 9, 10, 11, with legal residence and domicile or citizenship being moved down from where they used to be up here on lines 5 and 7 as we saw in the old form. So with that being said, as we thumb down, there's one big thing you might be used to seeing right here in part 1 around lines 11 through 18 or so, and that is the gift splitting election. It used to be the case that if you're going to make a gift splitting election, there'd be boxes to check there on whether the election is being made and whether their spouses were married at the time of the election, and also a line for the consenting spouse, i.e. the non-filing spouse, to sign and date the return to make effective that gift splitting election. But now what we see is just line 19 determining whether we want to make the gift splitting election, in which case we now have a brand new part 3 on page 2. So scrolling down, we see this brand new part 3, which changes some and doesn't change other items, but for the most part, this has a lot of the information you would have previously needed for the gift splitting election in terms of the boxes to check. But one significant change, and this is something you really need to be aware of, is that the consenting spouse can no longer simply sign and date the 709 of the filing spouse as consent to the gift splitting election. There's this new requirement that we now must attach a notice of consent. So with that notice of consent, that's similar to other attachments you might have, things like GST tax election statements, but that has to be typewritten by you and included with the return as a preparer. And it's a consent that the spouse must both sign and date. And importantly, you must be conscious of the dating requirements, because the gift splitting election has to be made no later than April 15th or on the first filed gift tax return. So if you file a return and fail to attach that notice of consent and get beyond the April 15th due date, it may be the case that without getting permission from the IRS, that you can then make an effective gift splitting election. So that's a significant change that you're going to need to be aware of. And this video accompanies a newsletter article I have at griffinbridgers.substack.com. So I'd encourage you to visit that article, and I'll have some bonus materials for practitioners and preparers only who are paid subscribers to the newsletter, which will have some sample forms and other items to assist with things like this notice of consent. So, huge changes to the gift splitting election. Now, as we scroll down, we notice we move from kind of a letter orientation to more of a landscape orientation on the form when we compare especially to the old Schedule A on the prior form, which was consistent with using simply a letter orientation throughout. Now we see expanded columns, which makes for generally a more user-friendly form. And we have more room, as seen on each part, to fill in the relevant gift information. As you see on the old form, this was the 2023 version, we only had 4 lines that were functionally available for parts 1, 2, and 3, with 4 others for the split gifts of a spouse if a gift splitting election was made, which practically meant nothing could ever be filled in on these. Most of the time it meant a practitioner was filling in see attached and then including a separate statement which listed out each gift here. But now we see a much more user-friendly, or somewhat user-friendly format of broader columns, more columns as we'll talk about, cells which could potentially be cut and pasted into Excel in a substantially similar format to this, in a way that allows us to better edit this if we do indeed run out of room. But largely for most gifts, there should be, if you're only making a couple each year, enough room on this schedule. So first big change when we look at this too is that traditionally we had to include all this information on column B. We had to include everything we need to disclose about the donee, their name and address, relationship to donor, their taxpayer ID. We also had to include description of gift, along with securities, QTIPs, EINs of any entity involved, and notably too, with that description of gift, all in this column, we typically had to include things like maybe references to election statements, references to attachments like valuations, sometimes descriptions of valuation methods or other items we want the IRS to know about the gift. So a lot of this information now, with our wider landscape format, has now been broken out into 3 separate columns. We have donor's name and address, relationship to donor, and then column D, description of gift. Now the one shortfall or shortcoming of this new format is that, frankly, I think column B should have been narrower and that column D should be wider, because the description of the gift is usually the biggest part, so you're still kind of stuck now if you use this form, cramming a lot of information into that very narrow column D compared to the length of words and sentences often used in a properly crafted gift description. So that's one thing to note on the new form, and one thing to note too, if you're going to take this, if you don't have tax prep software, and try to freeform your own Schedule A, maybe in Excel or some other format, in order to have attachments to 709s. Now with that being said too, we also find a new format of boxes over here to check. It used to be that on column C, what we would see usually, not on part 1 here, which deals with gifts only subject to gift tax, but instead on parts 2 and 3, and I'll reference back over to the old 709, we see in column C, we used to have this election. And what that dealt with is, for direct skips or indirect skips, an election out of automatic allocation, and in the case of indirect skips, also certain other GST tax elections, like electing to treat a trust as a GST trust, or perhaps a termination of a prior election out or a prior GST trust election. Now we see that these items have moved over to their own separate column, column J for direct skips, and column N for indirect skips, and we see them preceded by all these other columns over here, and also on part 1, a bunch of different columns as well. And the biggest change, and one you're definitely going to have to remember, is that charitable gifts and gifts to a spouse that might be eligible for the charitable or marital deductions respectively now require the checking of the box for each item to which they apply. So with that, I could see this being an issue in the future, for example, where we have the 709, which is or a 706, which is a separate form typically for the QTIP election. You have to list out QTIP property on a certain part of Schedule M and non-QTIP property on another. And that's often gotten wrong. It's one of my most popular articles on my newsletter, and it's something where often people have to go back and get permission from the IRS to change the form after it's too late to amend. And with that being said, I could see that being an issue here, where traditionally, in order to make the election, I'm about to get back to the old form now, what you would run into is listing out on part 4 of Schedule A in either line 4 for the marital deduction or line 7 for the charitable deduction, the line numbers or item numbers from Schedule A to which the deductions related and were being claimed. But now, in the new form, we still see somewhat of that same format, but instead of listing out line items now, you have to indicate those items for which the boxes in column L or column K are checked. And presumably, if you don't check that box, then simply listing the dollar amount here may not be fully effective. So that's something that preparers are going to have to be conscious of from now on when preparing 709s. So that's a big change as well. Another one relates to GST tax. So in particular, if you have a QTIP trust, what you can do is call the reverse QTIP election for GST tax, which says that even though at some point in the future the beneficiary spouse of a QTIP trust will become the deemed transferor for GST tax purposes by virtue of gross estate inclusion or taxable gifts inclusion, you can avoid that outcome by making what's called a reverse QTIP election, so that the donor spouse is treated as the transferor for GST tax purposes, notwithstanding any future gross estate or taxable gift inclusion with respect to the beneficiary spouse. It used to be the case that that election was found on Part 2 of Schedule D. I'm back to the old form now, where we see the old part where if we were making this election under Code Section 2652A3, we had to check a box here, then enter the line items of what we're going to make that election for back from Schedule A. But switching back to the new form, much like we just saw with the marital and charitable deduction, we now have a new column M in which we have to make that election by checking the appropriate box for the line item. Now, with that being said, because donee descriptions and gift descriptions are often broad, you're going to have to be very careful on this as well to make sure that when you have a multi-line item, that perhaps the box lines up with the item number, and presumably that wouldn't be a fatal error. If you check the box next to any of the items in that, or any of the lines in that item, it should presumably be enough. But that's another level of detail that or even grunt work, I'd say, that a lot of preparers and reviewers are going to have to go through when looking at this form. Now, with that being said, when we're on the QTIP election element here, one thing that hasn't changed is going down to Part 4, there's never been a clear way on the 709 to make a partial QTIP election. What hasn't changed is this description, which is also found in the old form, which says if you're only making a partial QTIP election, just include the dollar value of that up here in line 4. Now the problem with doing that is there's no way to know which specific item that partial QTIP election relates to. And that was a problem under both the old form and the new form, and I think it's a good idea to either have a separate statement by line item saying to which part of each item the marital deduction is actually being claimed through that partial QTIP election, or perhaps to include it here in the description of gift where appropriate. Now, I know with the description of gift, we have a narrow column, as I mentioned, so that's even more to try to cram into that already narrow column. So another issue you need to keep in mind, but it's still a good idea regardless to maybe include for each gift item for which you're making the QTIP election the dollar value to which it correlates if you're making a partial QTIP election. If the QTIP election is going to apply to the entire item, perhaps there's nothing to do there and it's best to just leave that silent and carry over the full deduction amount. But you're going to want to make sure what's in line 4 correlates and adds up to the total amount of the items for which column L is checked. Now, as we move on, those are really the difficult changes to this. We also see this similar cell-friendly landscape format in Schedule B, where we have to list gifts from prior periods. We can see that's substantially changed from the format on the old one, which didn't necessarily have cells and was given half a page. Now it has its own standalone page, and it's a lot easier, especially for clients with gift tax returns from every year, perhaps going back to 1977, that have to be listed here. Likewise, Schedule C, if there's any ported over to see spousal unused exclusion amount, now gets its own standalone page, again in landscape format, and much broader and easier to deal with than the narrow one, which was only given half a page on the old form. We also see a similar change when we look at Schedule D, which already kind of had some of that cell format, but we get wider columns, and really we have no changes to the columns here as well. So big change on Schedule D, as I alluded to earlier, is the removal of reverse QTIP elections from the start of Part 2, but for the most part, we still have the same lines that apply whether you're automatically or manually allocating GST exemption. Likewise, with direct skips, we still have the same columns and the same allocation to direct skips down in Part 3 of Schedule D. But with that being said, one thing that hasn't changed is any election you're making for GST purposes, including an election out and a notice of allocation, still requires a separate written attachment that has to be included. And one thing I think a lot of people perhaps get wrong that might have been in the prior instructions, but is definitely in the new ones too, is that there's often an assumption that if you're partially electing out of automatic allocation for direct skips, that you simply just need to list maybe 0 or an amount less than the gift itself here on column C of Part 3 of Schedule D. But the instructions also note for direct skips, you also need to include a separate election out statement for that election. But that being said, those are the major changes to Form 709 for gifts in 2024 and beyond. This isn't intended to be an all-inclusive discussion, but I hope that helps you to get a better grasp on what exactly is going on. If you have any questions, you can reach me, as always, at griffin@griffinbridgers.com, with the caveat that I cannot give tax or legal advice in response to your questions or counsel you if you're an individual in need of assistance with this form for yourself. But that being said, thank you for joining me for this video, and I look forward to seeing you in my future content.